lonely man took the blame so the native girl could live. Next morning, her tribe bowed before him. The Wyoming Territory stretched endless under a merciless August sun. Dust devils danced across the flatlands, and the town of Bitter Creek sat like a wound on the landscape, all weathered wood and broken promises. This was where men came to disappear, and where Thomas Merrick had been disappearing for 3 years. Thomas stood outside the general store, his hat pulled low against the glare. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the quiet stillness of someone who had learned that movement attracted attention, and attention brought questions he preferred not to answer. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots resoled twice over. He worked odd jobs, asked for nothing, and spoke even less. The townspeople knew him as reliable and forgettable, which suited him perfectly. The store owner, a thick-necked man named Caldwell, emerged carrying a crate of tinned goods. Thomas helped him load it onto a wagon without being asked. Caldwell grunted something approximating thanks and pressed $2 silver into Thomas's palm. It was fair pay for 15 minutes of work, maybe even generous, but Thomas understood the unspoken arrangement. He took the money because refusing charity meant explaining why he didn't need it, and explanations led to conversations he avoided. Across the rutted main street, a commotion was building outside the marshal's office. Thomas felt the shift in atmosphere before he saw the cause. A small crowd had gathered, their voices carrying that particular edge of excitement people get when violence seems imminent but not yet personal. He should have walked away. He should have headed back to the boarding house where he rented a narrow room and counted himself lucky to have walls and a roof. Instead, something pulled his attention toward the growing mob. The marshal, a political appointee named Vance, who wore his badge like a shield against competence, stood on the wooden walkway. Beside him was a young woman, and Thomas felt his breath catch despite himself. She wore traditional Shoshone clothing, deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light. Her black hair fell in a single braid down her back, and her chin was raised in defiance even as her hands were bound with rope. She couldn't have been more than 20, with sharp, intelligent eyes that scanned the crowd without fear, only calculation. Marshal Vance addressed the gathering crowd with the self-importance of a small man given temporary authority. The woman had been caught, he announced, attempting to steal from the feed store. The owner, a pinch-faced man named Hoskins, stood nearby nodding vigorously, his thin arms crossed over his chest. The evidence was clear, Vance continued. She had been found with 2 bags of seed corn that didn't belong to her. Theft was theft, regardless of circumstances, and the law would be applied equally. Thomas knew this was a lie before Vance finished speaking. Nothing in Bitter Creek was applied equally. The town existed on stolen land, built with stolen timber, populated largely by men running from stolen lives. But a Shoshone woman with seed corn presented an opportunity for the townspeople to feel righteous, and righteousness was a rare commodity they seized whenever possible. The young woman's name was Ayanna, Thomas learned from the murmuring crowd. She was from a small band camped 15 miles north, one of the few groups still trying to maintain their traditional ways despite the reservations, the broken treaties, and the systematic destruction of everything they had known. The winter had been brutal, the spring late, and the stored food supplies were dangerously low. Everyone knew this. Everyone also knew that acknowledging it would require compassion, and compassion complicated the simple narrative of civilization versus savagery that the town preferred. Hoskins was explaining in a loud voice how he had caught her red-handed, how she had actually smiled at him when discovered, as if theft was some kind of joke. The crowd's murmur grew uglier. Someone mentioned the territorial judge who was due to pass through in 6 weeks. Someone else suggested that 6 weeks was a long time to feed a prisoner, and maybe faster justice was more economical. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Thomas felt something crack inside him. A seal he had carefully maintained for 3 years, breaking under pressure he hadn't known was building. He had come to Bitter Creek to be invisible, to let the man he had been dissolve into the man he was pretending to be. He had succeeded so well that sometimes he forgot which version was real. But watching Ayanna stand straight-backed and silent while men who had never faced real hunger debated her fate over stolen seed corn, he remembered exactly who he had been and why he had run from it. He stepped forward before his mind could overrule his body. The crowd parted slightly, surprised by movement from a man they had filed away as scenery. Marshal Vance's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Thomas removed his hat and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect that immediately changed the dynamic. "The seed corn wasn't stolen," Thomas said. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying the authority of simple truth. He had purchased it from Hoskins 3 days prior and asked the woman to collect it for him as he was occupied with work. There must have been some misunderstanding, some failure of communication, but no theft had occurred. The silence that followed was profound. Hoskins's face cycled through confusion, anger, and calculation. Marshal Vance's expression suggested he was trying to determine whether this complication made his life easier or harder. The crowd seemed almost disappointed, their entertainment evaporating like morning dew. Hoskins found his voice first, sputtering that he had no record of such a transaction, that he would certainly remember selling seed corn to Thomas, that this was obviously a fabrication. Thomas reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled receipt. He had actually purchased nails 2 weeks ago, but Hoskins's record-keeping was legendarily poor, and the faded pencil marks could represent anything. He held it out without comment. Marshal Vance snatched the paper, studied it with the concentration of a man whose reading skills were limited, then looked from Thomas to Ayanna and back again. The calculation in his eyes was transparent. Believing Thomas meant releasing the woman and losing the crowd's approval. Challenging Thomas meant investigating, asking questions, potentially uncovering that he was lying, and then having to decide whether enforcing the law against a white man was worth the precedent. The standoff stretched. Ayanna's eyes had found Thomas, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. There was no gratitude there, only assessment. She was measuring him, trying to understand his angle, because kindness without motive was not something she had encountered often enough to expect it. Marshal Vance made his decision with a theatrical sigh. If Thomas Merrick wanted to vouch for this woman, that was his right as a citizen. However, the seed corn would need to be returned to Hoskins immediately, and there would be a fine for the disturbance. Thomas agreed to both terms before Vance finished speaking. The marshal untied Ayanna's hands with obvious reluctance, warned her about respecting property rights, and dismissed the crowd with the air of a man who had successfully navigated a crisis of his own making. The spectators dispersed slowly, some casting backward glances filled with disappointment or suspicion. Hoskins retreated into his store, muttering about the erosion of standards. Thomas found himself standing alone with Ayanna on the sun-bleached street, aware that he had just irrevocably changed his careful, invisible existence. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes missing nothing. Then she spoke, her English accented but precise, each word chosen with care. "You are a fool or a liar," she said. "Probably both." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The assessment was fair. He gestured toward the edge of town, away from watching eyes and listening ears. They walked in silence, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust. The afternoon heat pressed down like a hand, and cicadas sang their relentless song from the sparse vegetation. At the town's edge, where the buildings gave way to scrubland and the illusion of civilization faded, Ayanna stopped and turned to face him. The 2 bags of seed corn sat in the dirt where Vance had dropped them. She made no move to retrieve them. "Why?" she asked. It was not a simple question. It contained layers. Why help me? Why lie? Why risk your position in this town for someone you do not know? Thomas considered several answers. He could claim moral obligation, Christian charity, or simple decency. All would be partially true and completely inadequate. Instead, he told her something closer to honesty. "I have been someone else for 3 years," he said. "Someone smaller, quieter, less troublesome. Today I remembered who I was before, and I did not like how easily I had forgotten." Ayanna absorbed this, her expression unreadable. She asked if he expected gratitude, payment, or something else. The question was direct, almost harsh, but Thomas understood the necessity. Trust was expensive, and she had learned not to spend it carelessly. He expected nothing, he told her, and meant it. The lie to the marshal was his problem now, not hers. She should take the seed corn and go before Vance changed his mind or Hoskins decided to make trouble. The fine he had agreed to pay was his own foolishness. She surprised him by laughing, a short, sharp sound without much humor. She asked if he understood what he had done. In claiming the seed corn was his, in vouching for her, he had tied himself to her story. If she was caught stealing again, if her people were accused of any crime, his word would be remembered and measured. He had made himself responsible without understanding the weight of that responsibility. Thomas acknowledged this with a nod. He was learning slowly that invisibility was not the same as peace, and that avoiding responsibility was just another form of cowardice. Ayanna picked up the bags of seed corn, hefting them with practiced ease. She told him her name, though he had already heard it from the crowd. He told her his, and they stood for a moment in that strange space between strangers and something else, something undefined. She asked where he lived. When he told her about the boarding house, she shook her head. She said he should be careful, that Hoskins was a petty man who held grudges, and that Marshal Vance would not forget being made to look uncertain in front of the town. Thomas had painted a target on himself, and men like that waited for opportunities to reassert their authority. He thanked her for the warning, though they both knew it came too late to matter. The decision had been made, the consequences set in motion. Ayanna studied him one last time, as if committing his face to memory for reasons he could not guess, then turned and walked north, toward the distant mountains and the camp he had heard about but never seen. Thomas watched her until she disappeared into the heat shimmer and the vast indifference of the landscape. Then he walked back into town, feeling the weight of eyes on him from darkened doorways and behind dusty windows. The invisible man had become visible, and there was no going back. That evening, Thomas paid the fine to Marshal Vance, who accepted the money with a smile that promised future complications. He returned to his boarding house and lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what version of himself would wake up tomorrow. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closer, as if his moment of action had expanded something inside him that no longer fit in the carefully constructed box of his new life. 3 days passed. Thomas worked, ate, and slept according to his established routine, but something had shifted. The townspeople who had barely noticed him before now watched him with speculation. Caldwell at the general store asked pointed questions about his relationship with the Indian girl. The boarding house owner mentioned casually that some guests attracted less favorable attention than others. Even the banker, a man Thomas had never spoken to directly, found reason to cross paths and offer unsolicited advice about maintaining proper associations. Thomas said little and offered less. He had learned in his previous life that explanations were often taken as excuses, and excuses implied guilt. Better to remain silent and let people draw their own conclusions, however wrong they might be. On the 4th day, Ayanna returned. She appeared at dawn when the town was still mostly asleep and the light was soft and golden. Thomas was hauling water from the communal well when he saw her standing near the livery stable, partially obscured by shadow. She wore different clothes this time, simpler, with a woven shawl against the morning chill. Her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders, and she carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He approached slowly, aware that being seen together again would cement whatever rumors were already circulating. Ayanna seemed unconcerned with discretion. She held out the bundle, and when Thomas took it, he felt the warmth of fresh bread through the fabric. "Payment," she said simply, "for the fine you paid." Thomas started to refuse, to explain that payment was unnecessary, but she cut him off with a gesture. She told him that accepting help without acknowledgement created debt, and debt created obligation, and obligation could be twisted into chains. Better to close the account cleanly. He unwrapped the bread, still steaming slightly in the cool air. It was made with corn flour, dense and substantial, the kind of food meant to sustain rather than delight. He broke off a piece and ate it, and Ayanna's expression softened almost imperceptibly at the acceptance. She told him about her camp, though he had not asked. 15 families, mostly elders and children, with a handful of hunters and even fewer warriors. They were trying to maintain independence, refusing the reservation because the land there was barren and the government rations were insufficient and irregular. But independence meant hunger, and hunger made people desperate, and desperation led to situations like the one at Hoskins's store. Thomas listened without interrupting. She was not asking for sympathy or help, merely stating facts with the clarity of someone who had learned to see reality without the comfort of illusion. She asked about him then, direct questions he had avoided for 3 years. Where he came from, what he ran from, why he chose a place like Bitter Creek to rebuild a life. Thomas found himself answering with more honesty than he intended, the words emerging like water from a cracked dam. He had been a different man in a different place, he told her. A man with prospects and position, with a family name that opened doors and a future that seemed predetermined. But that future had been built on foundations he came to despise, exploitation disguised as progress, cruelty masked as efficiency, and the systematic destruction of anything that did not serve profit. When he objected, when he tried to change things from inside, he learned that systems protect themselves first and always. So he had walked away from all of it. The money, the name, the future. He had come west with nothing, seeking nothing, hoping that in becoming no one he might find peace. Bitter Creek had seemed perfect in its insignificance, a place where he could exist without consequence. Ayanna absorbed this story with the same careful attention she had given everything else. She asked if he had found what he was looking for. Thomas admitted he did not know. Peace and emptiness looked similar from the inside, and he was no longer sure he could tell the difference. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from guarded to genuinely amused. She told him he was definitely a fool, but perhaps not entirely a liar. The distinction seemed important to her. They talked as the sun climbed higher and the town began to wake. Ayanna spoke of her people's history, the slow erosion of everything they had known, the impossible choice between cultural death on the reservation or physical death from starvation. Thomas told her about the East, the city she had never seen, the way progress consumed everything in its path and called it civilization. There was an ease to the conversation that surprised them both. They were from different worlds, shaped by different forces, but they recognized in each other something familiar, the exhaustion of fighting systems too large to defeat, and the stubborn refusal to surrender completely. As the morning advanced, Ayanna prepared to leave. She thanked him again for his intervention, though the thanks carried an undertone of warning. The situation was not resolved, merely postponed. Hoskins would not forget, and Vance would look for opportunities to reassert authority. Thomas should be cautious. He walked with her to the edge of town, both of them aware of curtains moving in windows and doors opening slightly for better views. The invisible man and the Indian woman together again, providing fresh material for speculation and rumor. Before she left, Ayanna did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of connection that felt weighted with meaning he could not quite decipher. She told him that her people had a concept, difficult to translate, about debts that transcended simple exchange. He had taken a risk for her, claimed responsibility for her actions, and in doing so had created a bond that her culture recognized even if his did not. Thomas did not fully understand, but he nodded acceptance. Ayanna turned and walked away, and this time he did not watch her disappear. Instead, he turned back to face the town, the curious eyes, the whispered conversations. The invisible man was gone. Someone else stood in his place, someone who would have to navigate consequences he had set in motion without fully understanding where they would lead. The following week brought escalating tension like a summer storm building on the horizon. Marshal Vance found reasons to patrol near wherever Thomas was working, his presence a silent reminder of authority and suspicion. Hoskins spread stories about theft and deception, embellishing details with each retelling until the simple incident had grown into an elaborate conspiracy. Other townspeople, sensing an opportunity to align themselves with power, began treating Thomas with cold formality or outright hostility. The boarding house owner, a widow named Mrs. Henshaw, informed him that his room would be needed at the end of the month. She delivered this news with apologetic firmness, explaining that she had to consider her reputation and the comfort of her other guests. Thomas understood the unspoken message. His association with Ayanna had made him a liability, and liabilities were expensive in small towns where social standing was currency. He began looking for alternative lodging, but found doors closing before they fully opened. The blacksmith had a room above his shop, but regretfully it was already promised to someone else. The hotel keeper mentioned that rates had recently increased beyond what most working men could afford. Even Caldwell at the general store, who had been consistently friendly, now conducted business with the bare minimum of conversation. Thomas recognized the pattern. He was being squeezed, pressured to leave town or at minimum to publicly distance himself from the situation he had created. It was a familiar tactic, one he had seen employed in his previous life against those who challenged accepted norms. The method was different, but the mechanism identical. Social isolation as punishment, belonging as reward for compliance. He could have left. Bitter Creek was not unique, and Wyoming offered countless other towns where he could restart his anonymous existence. But something had changed inside him during that moment of intervention, some internal compass that had been dormant realigning itself. Leaving now would mean admitting that his action had been impulse rather than principle, and he was not ready to make that admission. Ayanna returned on the 8th day after their last conversation. This time she came at midday, walking directly down the main street with the confidence of someone who had decided that hiding served no purpose. She carried another bundle, larger than before, and she made no attempt at discretion as she approached Thomas where he was repairing a fence behind the livery stable. The livery owner, a gruff man named Patterson, stopped his work to watch. Across the street, several townspeople emerged from buildings to observe. The audience was deliberate and Ayanna knew it. This was not a private visit but a public statement, though of what, Thomas could not yet determine. She handed him the bundle, which proved to contain smoked meat, dried berries, and several pieces of worked leather. Thomas started to protest the generosity, but Ayanna's expression stopped him. This was not charity or payment, she explained. This was reciprocity, the foundation of her culture's economy. He had given something of value at personal cost. She was returning value in kind. To refuse would be to reject the relationship itself. Thomas accepted the bundle, acutely aware of the watching eyes and the conclusions being drawn. Ayanna seemed entirely unbothered by the attention. She asked how he was managing, if the town was making things difficult. Her directness was both refreshing and alarming. He admitted that his living situation had become complicated, that his welcome in Bitter Creek was eroding. Ayanna nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected. She told him that her people were familiar with towns that changed their minds about hospitality, with promises that evaporated when inconvenient, Then she made an offer that surprised him completely. Her camp had extra space, she said, a shelter that had belonged to a family who had chosen the reservation. It was small but sound and would provide adequate protection from weather. If he needed somewhere to stay, somewhere beyond the reach of men like Vance and Hoskins, it was available. Thomas felt the weight of the offer. Accepting meant leaving the town entirely, abandoning even the pretense of fitting into white society. It meant aligning himself explicitly with people the town viewed as obstacles to progress at best, threats at worst. It meant burning bridges he might need to cross again. But it also meant something else. It meant choosing a side, making a stand, becoming visible in a way that terrified and exhilarated him simultaneously. He did not answer immediately. Ayanna waited patiently, understanding that some decisions required time. Around them, the watching town held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was happening even if they could not articulate what. Marshal Vance appeared then, as if summoned by the weight of the moment. He walked toward them with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture meant to be noticed. He addressed Ayanna formally, asking her business in town. She replied that she was conducting trade with a citizen, which was legal and not the marshal's concern. Vance's jaw tightened. He shifted his attention to Thomas, asking if there was a problem, if the woman was causing a disturbance. The question was a trap, offering Thomas an opportunity to ally himself with authority by confirming that Ayanna was unwelcome. Thomas chose differently. He stated clearly that there was no disturbance, that Ayanna was his guest, and that their business was private. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Vance's eyes narrowed, calculating. He was being challenged, however politely, and in front of witnesses. His authority was being questioned by a man who had been, until recently, beneath notice. The marshal could escalate, could manufacture a reason to assert control, but doing so risked looking weak if Thomas did not back down. After a long moment, Vance stepped back. He delivered a warning about loitering and disturbing the peace, directed at both of them, but primarily for the benefit of the watching crowd. Then he walked away, his posture radiating suppressed anger. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its implications would echo for far longer. Thomas had publicly aligned himself with Ayanna, had claimed her as someone under his protection or at minimum someone whose presence he sanctioned. The invisible man had become not just visible but conspicuous. Ayanna watched the marshal retreat, then turned back to Thomas with an expression that mixed respect and concern. She told him he had just made his situation significantly worse. Vance was prideful and would not forget being made to back down. Hoskins would see this as confirmation of conspiracy. The town would view it as choosing the wrong side. Thomas acknowledged all of this because denial served no purpose. Then he asked about the shelter at her camp, the details of what accepting her offer would entail. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly, surprised that he was seriously considering it. She explained that her people lived simply. That comfort was measured differently than in towns like Bitter Creek. There would be work, because everyone contributed to survival. There would be curiosity and possibly suspicion, because a white man choosing to live among them was unprecedented. But there would also be safety from men like Vance and freedom from the social mechanisms that towns use to enforce conformity. Thomas made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He told her he would need 2 days to settle his affairs in town, to collect what little he owned and close accounts cleanly. On the 3rd day at dawn, he would meet her at the northern edge of town, and she could guide him to the camp. Ayanna studied his face, searching for doubt or hesitation. Finding neither, she nodded acceptance. She warned him one final time that this choice would mark him, that returning to normal society would become exponentially harder. He was closing a door that would not easily reopen. Thomas understood and chose to walk through anyway. The 2 days Thomas spent settling his affairs in Bitter Creek felt like watching a life dissolve in real time. He collected his few possessions from the boarding house while Mrs. Henshaw watched with tight-lipped disapproval. He closed his account at the general store, where Caldwell counted out his remaining credit in coins without meeting his eyes. He returned borrowed tools to Patterson at the livery, who accepted them with a grunt that might have been farewell or good riddance. Word of his impending departure spread faster than he could pack. By the afternoon of the second day, the entire town understood that Thomas Merrick was leaving to join the Indian camp. The reactions ranged from scandalized whispers to open contempt. A few people, very few, approached him privately to express something that might have been respect or might have been pity for a man they believed was throwing his life away. The Methodist preacher, a thin man with kind eyes named Reverend Polk, found Thomas as he was leaving the boarding house for the last time. The Reverend asked if Thomas had truly considered what he was doing, if he understood the implications of abandoning civilized society. Thomas replied that he had considered it carefully and that perhaps civilization was a more complicated concept than either of them had been taught to believe. Reverend Polk sighed deeply, then pressed a small Bible into Thomas's hand. He said that wherever Thomas went, whatever choices he made, he would need guidance beyond his own judgment. Thomas accepted the book with genuine gratitude, though both men understood that their definitions of divine guidance likely diverged significantly. That night, Thomas slept in the livery stable, Patterson having grudgingly allowed him to use an empty stall after the boarding house ejected him a day early. He lay in the straw listening to horses shift and breathe in the darkness, thinking about the life he was leaving and the unknown future he was choosing. Fear and excitement tangled together until he could not separate them, becoming a single emotion he had no name for. Dawn arrived cold and clear. Thomas gathered his belongings, which fit into a single canvas bag, and walked through the silent town toward its northern edge. A few early risers watched from windows, their faces pale in the dim light. No one called out goodbye or wished him well. He was already gone in their minds, already relegated to the category of those who had failed to fit into the proper order of things. Ayanna was waiting where she had promised, seated on a flat rock with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to measuring time differently. She wore traveling clothes, practical and worn, with her hair braided tightly back. When she saw Thomas approaching, she stood and studied him carefully, as if assessing whether he had changed his mind during the night. He had not. He reached the rock, set down his bag, and waited for her to lead. They walked north together as the sun climbed higher, leaving Bitter Creek shrinking behind them until it disappeared into the landscape entirely. The terrain changed gradually from flatland to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. Ayanna moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every rock and gully, while Thomas followed, adjusting to the rhythm of travel without roads or clear paths. They spoke little during the journey. The silence between them was comfortable, lacking the tension that usually filled empty conversation. Occasionally, Ayanna would point out landmarks invisible to Thomas's untrained eye, a spring marked by specific vegetation, a game trail indicated by disturbed earth, a distant ridge that served as navigation when the sun was hidden. By midday, they stopped to rest beside a small creek. Ayanna produced dried meat and hard bread from her pack, sharing it without comment. Thomas ate slowly, aware that his body was already protesting the unfamiliar exertion. He had worked hard in Bitter Creek, but this was different, this constant movement across uneven ground under the relentless sun. Ayanna asked if he was certain about his choice. She emphasized that arriving at the camp would be easier than staying there. That novelty would fade quickly and leave only the daily reality of a life very different from anything he had known. Thomas replied that certainty was probably impossible, but commitment was not, and he was committed to seeing where this path led. She smiled at that, a quick flash of warmth that transformed her usually guarded expression. She told him he was learning, slowly, to speak truth instead of comfort. It was a useful skill where they were going. They reached the camp as afternoon shadows lengthened. It sat in a sheltered valley where a river bent around a stand of cottonwoods, providing water and wind protection. Thomas counted 12 lodges arranged in a loose circle, along with several smaller structures that appeared to serve various practical functions. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the smell of roasting meat drifted on the breeze. People emerged from the lodges as Ayanna and Thomas approached. Children came first, curious and bold, circling at a distance to study the stranger. Then came women, their faces revealing varying degrees of suspicion, curiosity, and calculation. Finally, the men appeared, moving with deliberate slowness, their body language communicating controlled assessment. An older man stepped forward, his weathered face marked by a lifetime of survival and compromise. He was small and wiry, with gray streaking through his black hair, but he carried himself with unmistakable authority. This was Napashni, Ayanna explained quietly, the headman who guided the camp through consensus and wisdom rather than force. Napashni addressed Ayanna in their language, his tone neutral but his eyes constantly returning to Thomas. She responded at length, gesturing occasionally toward Thomas but never touching him or indicating familiarity beyond what the situation required. The conversation continued for several minutes while Thomas stood silent, aware of dozens of eyes measuring him from every angle. Finally, Napashni switched to English, directing his words to Thomas with careful formality. He asked why a white man would choose to leave his people and come to a camp facing starvation and persecution. It was not accusation but genuine inquiry, an attempt to understand motivation that seemed to contradict self-interest. Thomas answered honestly. He told Napashni about Bitter Creek, about the incident with the seed corn, about the choice he had made and the consequences that followed. He explained that he had lived 3 years as a ghost, invisible and silent, and that helping Ayanna had reminded him that invisibility was a form of death. He was here because she had offered shelter when his own people had withdrawn it, but also because something in him needed to choose connection over safety. Napashni listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the headman was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he spoke in measured tones about the reality Thomas was entering. The camp survived on the margins, taking what the land provided and avoiding the reservation's slow cultural death. They welcomed no one lightly because resources were scarce and trust expensive. But if Ayanna vouched for this stranger, if she believed his presence would add value rather than burden, then he would be given opportunity to prove himself. The shelter Ayanna had mentioned was shown to Thomas by an older woman named Lomasi, whose deeply lined face suggested both hardship and resilience. It was small, as promised, constructed of poles and hides with a fire pit at its center. The previous occupants had left it in good condition, and it would provide adequate protection from weather and animals. Thomas set down his bag and stood in the center of the shelter, feeling the weight of his choice settle over him like a physical thing. This was real now, no longer theoretical. He had left everything familiar for this space, these people, this uncertain future. Ayanna appeared in the entrance, carrying an armload of firewood. She told him that first impressions would determine his acceptance or rejection by the camp. People would watch how he worked, how he responded to difficulty, whether he expected special treatment or adapted to their ways. She could smooth his entry but could not guarantee his success. Thomas understood. He asked what he should do, how he should begin. Ayanna set down the firewood and met his eyes directly. She told him to be useful without being arrogant, to learn without pretending ignorance was wisdom, to respect their ways while maintaining his own integrity, and most importantly, to understand that trust was earned slowly and lost instantly. The first week tested Thomas in ways he had not anticipated. The physical work was relentless, hauling water, gathering wood, helping with endless repairs and maintenance that survival required. His hands blistered and bled, his muscles screamed protest, and his body adjusted to sleeping on the ground and eating food that bore no resemblance to what he had known. But harder than the physical challenges was navigating the social complexity of the camp. Every interaction carried weight and meaning he struggled to interpret. Accepting help too readily suggested weakness. Refusing help suggested arrogance. Contributing to communal tasks required understanding unspoken hierarchies and protocols. Speaking too much marked him as presumptuous. Speaking too little suggested contempt or superiority. Ayanna became his interpreter, not of language but of culture. She explained why certain people avoided him and others sought him out. She taught him the difference between privacy and secrecy, between independence and isolation. She corrected his mistakes gently but firmly, understanding that ignorance was forgivable but disrespect was not. Slowly, incrementally, Thomas began to find his place. He discovered that his previous life, the one he had run from, had taught him skills useful here. He could read and write, which proved valuable when dealing with the few traders who would still work with the camp. He understood contracts and agreements, which helped prevent the exploitation that desperate people often faced. He could plan and organize, skills that translated across cultural boundaries. The children accepted him first, their curiosity overcoming caution. They taught him words in their language, laughing at his pronunciation but patient with his efforts. They showed him how to move quietly through brush, how to read weather signs, how to find edible plants among the poisonous. Their acceptance opened doors with their parents, who began to see Thomas as something other than a threat or burden. Napashni watched all of this with calculating eyes. He spoke with Thomas occasionally, asking questions that seemed casual but probed deep. He wanted to understand what Thomas had left behind, what he was running from, what he hoped to find. Thomas answered as honestly as he could, aware that anything less would be detected and judged harshly. Ayanna remained present but not possessive. She helped Thomas integrate without claiming ownership of him. Other women in the camp noticed this and drew their own conclusions. Thomas became aware of speculation about his relationship with Ayanna, about whether gratitude had transformed into something else. The truth was more complicated than camp gossip could capture. He was drawn to her, undeniably. Her strength, intelligence, and fierce independence attracted him in ways he had not experienced before. But their relationship existed in a space between cultures, defined by mutual respect and growing affection, but constrained by the reality of their circumstances. She had saved him as much as he had saved her, and neither was ready to name what was building between them. 3 weeks after Thomas's arrival, trouble came to the camp in the form of 6 men on horseback. They rode in at noon, when the sun was highest and shadows shortest, a time chosen to prevent ambush or concealment. They were led by Marshal Vance, his badge catching the light like a warning. Beside him rode Hoskins, looking vindicated and eager. The other 4 were townsmen Thomas recognized but had never known by name. The camp responded with controlled tension. Men moved toward weapons kept carefully out of sight. Women gathered children and withdrew toward the lodges. Napashni walked forward slowly, flanked by 2 younger warriors, projecting calm authority despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Vance addressed the camp in a loud voice, stating that he was looking for a fugitive named Thomas Merrick, wanted for questioning in connection with theft and fraud. The accusations were fabricated, Thomas knew immediately. This was revenge dressed as law enforcement, an excuse to extract him from the camp and reassert authority that had been challenged. Thomas felt Ayanna's hand on his arm, a brief touch of warning and solidarity. Then he stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He identified himself calmly, asking what specific crimes he was being accused of. Vance's smile was cold and satisfied. He listed a series of charges: falsifying receipts, conspiring to steal property, abandoning debts, corrupting morals. None of it would hold up under actual legal scrutiny. But out here, far from courts and witnesses, the marshal's word carried the weight of law. Thomas knew what was happening. If he went with them, They would ensure he never returned to tell a different version of events. An accident during transport, a failed escape attempt, any number of explanations for why a prisoner never reached trial. He had seen this pattern before in different contexts, but with identical mechanisms. Napashni stepped forward, speaking with careful formality. He stated that Thomas was a guest of the camp, under their protection. If the marshal had legitimate legal business, it should be conducted through proper channels with witnesses and documentation. Otherwise, he was trespassing on land where he had no jurisdiction. Vance's expression hardened. He replied that harboring a criminal made the entire camp complicit, that interfering with a lawful arrest had consequences. The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and unmistakable. The standoff stretched, both sides calculating odds and outcomes. Vance had numbers and guns, but starting a fight here would mean casualties he would have to explain. Napashni had righteousness and desperation, but protecting Thomas meant risking everyone. Then Ayana did something that shifted everything. She walked forward to stand beside Thomas, facing the marshal directly. She spoke clearly, her English precise and cutting. She stated that she had been the one caught with the seed corn, that Thomas had claimed responsibility to protect her, that everything that followed stemmed from that act of basic decency. If Vance wanted to arrest someone for interfering with his authority, he should arrest her for being the cause of his embarrassment. The declaration hung in the air like thrown dynamite. Vance's face cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation. He had not expected this, had not planned for Ayana to publicly claim the original incident. Arresting her would mean confronting the entire camp, would risk violence he might not survive. But backing down again, especially after riding out here with armed men, would destroy what remained of his authority. Thomas felt time slow and compress simultaneously. He understood what was about to happen, saw it unfolding like a familiar pattern. Vance was going to escalate, was going to reach for his gun or give an order that would turn this confrontation into bloodshed. And when that happened, people would die, starting with Ayana, who had made herself the most visible target. He made his decision in the space between heartbeats, acting on instinct and something deeper than thought. He stepped in front of Ayana, placing himself between her and the guns, and he claimed responsibility one final time. He stated clearly, loudly, that everything Vance accused him of was true. He had lied, had stolen, had abandoned his debts and corrupted morals. He was guilty of it all and would return to Bitter Creek to face whatever justice the marshal deemed appropriate. Ayana tried to speak, to object, but Thomas cut her off with a look that pleaded for trust. Napashni's eyes narrowed, reading the situation differently than those around him. He saw what Thomas was offering, himself as sacrifice to prevent greater violence, a lone target instead of communal conflict. Vance accepted immediately, sensing victory and not examining it too closely. He ordered Thomas to mount one of the spare horses they had brought, clearly anticipating this outcome. Thomas complied without resistance, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. As he climbed into the saddle, Ayana grabbed his leg, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. She hissed something in her language, rapid and fierce, then switched to English for everyone to hear. She told him he was a fool, that this solved nothing, that Vance would kill him before they reached town. Thomas looked down at her, memorizing her face, the anger and fear and something else he had no right to name. He told her quietly that some debts could only be repaid with the currency available, and this was all he had to offer. Then he asked her to trust him one more time, knowing it was unfair but necessary. The riders surrounded Thomas and began the journey back toward Bitter Creek. He looked back once and saw the entire camp watching. Ayana standing apart from the others, her fists clenched and her face a mask of controlled fury. Then the valley disappeared behind a rise and he was alone with 6 men who had every reason to ensure his silence. They rode for an hour before Vance called a halt in a narrow canyon, far from witnesses or interference. This was it, Thomas knew. This was where the accident would happen, where the fugitive would try to escape and force the marshal's hand. He had known this outcome when he surrendered, had chosen it consciously over the alternative. Vance dismounted and approached Thomas with cold satisfaction. He asked if Thomas had any last words, any final attempts at bargaining or pleading. Thomas replied that he did not. He had made his choices and would accept their consequences. But he added one thing, a request that Vance leave the camp alone, that his death settle whatever scores needed settling. The marshal laughed, a harsh sound without humor. He said Thomas was in no position to negotiate, that the Indian camp's fate was sealed the moment they harbored a criminal. After this was finished, Vance planned to return with more men and more authority to scatter the camp and force them onto the reservation where they belonged. Thomas felt something inside him go very still and very cold. He had accepted his own death, had made peace with that sacrifice. But knowing it would be meaningless, that Ayanna and the others would suffer anyway, ignited something he thought he had left behind in his previous life, controlled, calculating rage. Before Vance could react, before the other men could process what was happening, Thomas drove his heel into his horse's flank. The animal bolted forward, crashing into Vance and sending him sprawling. Thomas yanked the reins hard left, sending the horse charging toward the narrowest point of the canyon where the other riders could not easily follow. Shots rang out, bullets whining off rock and whistling past his head. He bent low over the horse's neck, making himself a smaller target, focusing entirely on the treacherous ground ahead. The horse stumbled once, nearly throwing him, then found its footing and accelerated into the maze of boulders and scrub that filled the canyon. Behind him, Vance was screaming orders, the posse scrambling to remount and pursue. But Thomas had surprise and desperation driving him, and the canyon's geography favored evasion over pursuit. He pushed the horse mercilessly, taking risks that should have killed them both, driven by the knowledge that capture meant not just his death, but the destruction of everyone who had sheltered him. He lost them in the broken landscape, using every trick he remembered from his youth when riding had been sport rather than survival. He doubled back, crossed streams to break his trail, walked the horse through shallow water to disguise their passage. By the time darkness fell, he was alone in the wilderness with no supplies, no plan, and no clear path forward. But he was alive, and as long as he was alive, Vance's threats remained theoretical rather than accomplished. Thomas made his way back toward the camp through the night, guided by stars and instinct. He arrived at dawn, exhausted and half dead from exposure, to find the entire camp mobilized and armed. They had expected Vance to return with violence, and they were prepared to sell their lives dearly rather than surrender. Ayanna saw him first, emerging from the darkness like a ghost. Her expression cycled through disbelief, relief, and fury so intense it was almost physical. She ran to him as he slid from the horse, catching him as his legs gave out beneath him. The camp erupted in controlled chaos. Napashini issued rapid orders. Scouts were sent to watch for pursuit. Weapons were distributed. Children and elders were moved to more defensible positions. And Thomas was carried to Ayanna's lodge, where she worked with fierce efficiency to treat his cuts, bruises, and the beginning stages of hypothermia. As she worked, she berated him in 2 languages, her hands gentle despite her angry words. She called him 10 kinds of fool, an idiot who thought dying solved problems, a white man too stupid to understand that sacrifice without strategy was just waste. Thomas accepted all of it, too tired to defend himself and recognizing truth in her fury. Finally, when her anger exhausted itself, she sat back and looked at him with eyes that held too much emotion to name. She asked why he had come back, why he had not kept running and saved himself. Thomas answered that he had nowhere else to go, that this place, these people, had become something he could not abandon, and more specifically, that she had become someone worth returning to, regardless of cost or consequence. The admission hung between them, raw and undefended. Ayana stared at him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She leaned forward and kissed him, not gently but with all the pent-up fear and relief and desperate affection that had been building since that first day at Hoskins's store. When she pulled back, her eyes were fierce. She told him that if he ever sacrificed himself stupidly again, she would kill him herself and save everyone the trouble. He promised to try to survive more intelligently in the future. Outside, Napashni called a council. The headman explained the situation with brutal clarity. Vance would return with more men, more guns, more determination. The camp could not win a direct confrontation. They had three choices: flee deeper into the wilderness, surrender to the reservation, or fight and die. Thomas, still recovering but present at Ayana's insistence, offered a fourth option. They could expose Vance, could use the same systems of law and authority the marshal claimed to represent. Thomas still had connections in the East, people from his previous life who owed him favors or at minimum correspondence. If they could get word to the territorial governor, to federal authorities, to newspapers that would print the truth about a corrupt marshal terrorizing peaceful people, they could turn Vance's own weapons against him. The council debated long into the night. Some argued that trusting white man's law was foolish when that law had broken every treaty and promise ever made. Others pointed out that they had no better options, that fighting was suicide and fleeing merely postponed the inevitable. Napashni finally made the decision. They would try Thomas's plan, but they would also prepare for the worst. Scouts would be sent to request help from other bands. Defenses would be strengthened. And if help did not come before Vance returned, they would fight rather than surrender. Thomas spent the next days writing letters, carefully crafted appeals to conscience and law. Ayana rode to the nearest town with a different marshal, 60 miles south, to send the telegrams and post the letters. It was a desperate gamble, trusting that systems built to oppress might be turned toward justice if properly leveraged. 10 days passed in tense preparation. Then scouts reported riders approaching, but not from Bitter Creek. These came from the territorial capital, bearing official insignia and led by a federal marshal with jurisdiction over regional law enforcement. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Vance's corruption was deeper than even Thomas had suspected, involving extortion, illegal land seizures, and abuse of authority that had affected dozens of people too afraid or powerless to complain. Thomas's letters had provided the catalyst, but the evidence accumulated quickly once authorities looked. Marshal Vance was arrested, along with several accomplices including Hoskins. The territorial governor, facing pressure from Eastern newspapers that had picked up the story, issued a formal apology to the camp and guaranteed their right to remain on their land unmolested. On the morning after Vance's arrest, as word spread through the camp that the immediate danger had passed, something remarkable happened. Napashni called the entire camp together and asked Thomas to stand before them. The headman spoke at length in his own language, his tone formal and ceremonial. Then he switched to English for Thomas's benefit. He explained that Thomas had twice sacrificed himself for their people, first for Ayana at Hoskins's store, then for the entire camp when faced with Vance's threats. He had brought knowledge and skills that helped them navigate the white man's systems. He had honored their ways while maintaining his own integrity, and in doing so, he had earned something rarely given to outsiders, acceptance as one of them. Then, as Thomas watched in stunned silence, Napashni bowed his head. And behind him, slowly, the entire tribe followed. Elders and children, warriors and mothers, all bowing in acknowledgement of debt and respect. Ayana stood beside Thomas, her hand finding his. She whispered that he had become what few white men ever achieved, a bridge between worlds, belonging fully to neither but valued by both. In the months that followed, Thomas's life found a balance he had never thought possible. He lived in the camp, learning their ways and teaching his own. He helped negotiate with traders, ensuring fair deals and mutual respect. He became a mediator when conflicts arose with neighboring settlements, his unique position allowing him to see both perspectives. And his relationship with Ayanna deepened from respect to partnership to something neither could exist without. They married in both traditions, honoring her culture and acknowledging his, creating something new from the combination. Years later, when people asked how Thomas had come to live among the Shoshone, he would tell them about a moment outside a general store, about seed corn and a choice to be visible instead of invisible. He would say that sometimes redemption comes not from running away from who you were, but from becoming who you should have been all along. And Ayanna, sitting beside him, would add that sometimes love begins with simple decency and grows when two people choose to stand together regardless of the cost. The tribe that bowed before him that morning never forgot the lonely man who took the blame so one of their own could live. And Thomas never forgot that in saving her, he had somehow saved himself.